The first time she walked out, she didn't slam the door, she didn't cry, she didn't even look back, and somehow that made it worse, because silence, when it replaces emotion, doesn't just end a moment, it erases it. He was only 8 years old when she left. Too young to understand abandonment, but old enough to feel the absence it created. At that age, he didn't know how to explain what had changed. He only knew that the house felt quieter in a way that didn't feel normal, and that the person who used to be there simply wasn't anymore. No explanation, no warning, just gone. And while everyone else tried to move forward, to adjust, to fill the space she left behind, he didn't, because some spaces don't get filled. They just stay there, shaping everything around them. They said she had her reasons, that things were complicated, that sometimes adults make decisions children can't understand. But explanations like that don't mean anything to a child who experiences the result without ever hearing the truth. And for him, the truth wasn't what people said. It was what stayed consistent. The empty chair. The unanswered questions. The quiet moments where something should have been there, but wasn't. And over time, those moments didn't feel surprising anymore. They felt expected, which is how absence becomes normal. His father didn't talk about her much. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood something important. Some questions don't have answers that help, so instead he focused on stability, routine, structure, the kind of environment that doesn't replace what was lost, but prevents everything else from falling apart. And for a child who saw the world differently, who processed things in ways others didn't always understand, that consistency mattered more than anything. School wasn't easy for him, not because he couldn't learn, but because the world around him moved in ways that didn't always make sense. Sounds were louder, changes felt bigger, interactions carried layers that others seemed to navigate effortlessly, but for him required effort, real effort. And while some people saw that as difficulty, others saw something else entirely: focus, precision. A way of thinking that didn't follow the usual path, but reached places others couldn't. His father noticed it early, not as a problem, but as a difference that needed understanding, and instead of trying to change him, he supported him, encouraged him, created space for him to grow in a way that worked for him, not against him. And that kind of support doesn't always show immediate results. But over time, it builds something strong. Years passed quietly, no dramatic moments, no sudden breakthroughs, just steady progress. Small improvements that, over time, became something significant. And while the world around him continued to move at its usual pace, he moved differently. Not slower, not faster, just precisely. By the time he reached his late teens, something had become clear: the way he saw patterns, the way he understood systems, the way he focused on details others overlooked. It wasn't a limitation, it was an advantage. But advantages only matter when they're recognized, and more importantly, when they're used. His father didn't push him into anything, didn't force direction. He simply provided opportunity, access, space to explore what came naturally. And slowly something began to form. Not loudly, not publicly, but effectively. What started as interest turned into skill. What started as skill turned into value. And value, when applied correctly, creates something else entirely. And by the time the world started noticing what he had built, the one person who had once walked away without looking back was already preparing to return. The first sign of her return didn't come through a call or a message. It came through information, indirect, unintentional, someone mentioning a name in a conversation that wasn't meant to carry weight, but did, because some names don't lose their impact over time. They just wait, and when they resurface, they don't feel new, they feel unfinished. At first, it didn't seem significant, just a passing detail. But then it appeared again, in a different context, from a different source. And that's when it stopped being coincidence, because patterns, once repeated, demand attention. And this pattern pointed to something specific: she was nearby. Not emotionally, not relationally, but physically, and proximity after years of absence is never accidental. His father noticed the shift before he said anything, not in behavior, but in awareness, the kind that sharpens quietly when something familiar begins to reappear in unfamiliar ways. He didn't react immediately, didn't ask questions right away, because reacting too early can turn uncertainty into confirmation. Instead, he waited, observed, allowed the situation to reveal itself naturally, because truth, when given enough space, doesn't hide. It aligns. The message finally came late one evening, short, direct, without emotion. I think it's time we talk. No explanation, no acknowledgement of the years in between, just a statement that assumed connection still existed. And that assumption said everything, because it ignored the distance, the silence, the absence that had defined everything since she left. And yet, there it was, an attempt to step back into something that hadn't been maintained. He didn't respond immediately, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he understood something important. Timing matters, not just in actions, but in responses. And responding too quickly gives control to the person who initiated the moment. So he waited, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because this wasn't just a conversation, it was a re-entry, and re-entries require boundaries. When he finally did respond, it wasn't emotional. It wasn't confrontational, it was simple. What do you want to talk about? And that question, while neutral on the surface, carried something deeper. It shifted responsibility, it required clarity, it removed assumption, and most importantly, it forced intention to be stated, not implied. Her reply came quickly, too quickly, as if she had been waiting for the opportunity, not the connection. She said she wanted to reconnect, to understand what she missed, to be part of his life again. The words were structured carefully, designed to sound reflective. But something about them didn't align, because genuine reflection acknowledges the past, and her message avoided it. He read it more than once, not for meaning, but for consistency, because consistency reveals intention, and what he noticed wasn't what she said, it was what she didn't say. No mention of leaving, no acknowledgement of absence, no ownership of the gap she created, just a focus on the present and what she wanted from it. His father saw the message too, not as a decision-maker, but as someone who understood the weight behind it. He didn't tell him what to do, didn't advise, just asked one question: what do you feel when you read that? And that question mattered more than any suggestion could have, because it centered the response not on logic, but on truth. He thought about it carefully, not emotionally, not reactively, just clearly. And the answer wasn't anger, it wasn't even confusion. It was distance, a kind of separation that had formed over years, not suddenly but steadily, and that kind of distance doesn't disappear just because someone decides to return. So he made a decision, not about her, but about himself. He agreed to meet, not out of obligation, not out of hope, but out of clarity, because sometimes facing something directly is the only way to understand it fully, and sometimes it's the only way to see it for what it really is. The place he chose to meet her wasn't accidental. It wasn't personal, and it wasn't familiar. It was neutral, quiet, a space where nothing carried history, so nothing could be used to reshape it. Because environments influence conversations more than people realize, and this conversation needed clarity, not comfort. He arrived early, not out of nervousness, but out of preparation. Sitting there, observing the space, grounding himself in something stable before stepping into something uncertain. Because uncertainty, when faced without preparation, can shift control without warning. When she walked in, time didn't slow down. It didn't pause. It moved exactly as it always had. But something else shifted, the perception of it. Because seeing someone after years of absence doesn't create emotion instantly. It creates awareness. She looked different, not dramatically. Just enough to show time had passed. But what stood out wasn't her appearance. It was her expression, composed, measured, as if she had rehearsed this moment, not emotionally but strategically. She smiled when she saw him, not widely, not warmly, just enough to establish tone. And that tone wasn't connection, it was control, because controlled expressions often aim to guide a conversation before it even begins. He noticed it immediately, not as a judgment, but as a detail, and details to him always mattered. They sat down, and for a brief moment there was silence. Not awkward, not tense, just present. And in that silence, something became clear. Neither of them was here for the same reason, because intention shapes presence, and their intentions were not aligned. She started the conversation, not with an apology, not with acknowledgement, but with a question. How have you been? Simple, familiar, but disconnected from reality, because that question assumes continuity, and continuity didn't exist here, not anymore, he answered briefly, factually, without emotional detail, because details, in conversations like this, create openings, and he wasn't there to create openings, he was there to understand something. She began talking about herself next, about where she had been, what she had done, the changes she had gone through. It was structured like a narrative, controlled, clean, but again something was missing because every story that's real includes responsibility, and hers didn't. He didn't interrupt, didn't challenge, just listened. Because sometimes, the more someone speaks without interruption, the more they reveal unintentionally. Then she shifted the conversation, subtly, almost smoothly, from past to present, from explanation to interest, asking about his work, his routine, his life. And this time, her questions had focus, specificity, direction. That's when it became clear, not emotionally, not suddenly, but logically, because patterns don't lie, and the pattern in her questions pointed towards something specific, not connection, but information. He answered carefully, not dishonestly, but selectively. Because transparency without trust isn't openness, it's exposure. And as the conversation continued, her interest became sharper, more targeted, less general. She wasn't just asking how he was doing, she was asking what he had built, because by now she knew. Not everything, but enough. Enough to understand that his life wasn't what she had left behind, that something had changed, significantly, and that's when the tone shifted again, slightly, but clearly, less curiosity, more engagement, more investment in the conversation. He started using different language, words like we, us, family, introducing connection not through history but through assumption. But connection isn't created by language, it's built through consistency, and consistency had been missing for years. He let her continue. Because at this point, interruption would only slow down what was naturally unfolding. And then it happened. Not dramatically, not abruptly, but clearly. She mentioned opportunity, not directly tied to him, but close enough to connect, talking about possibilities, future plans, and being involved. And in that moment, everything aligned. The timing, the approach, the structure of the conversation. This wasn't about reconnecting, it was about access. He didn't react when he realized it, not outwardly. Because reactions, especially immediate ones, give away position, and position in a moment like this is power. So instead of confronting her directly, he shifted something subtle, his attention. He stopped listening for meaning and started listening for intention. Because once intention becomes clear, words stop being important. And what she was saying now, the way she was saying it, the direction she was guiding the conversation toward it, all aligned too perfectly to be accidental. She leaned slightly forward as she spoke, her tone softening just enough to feel personal, not emotional calculated. And there's a difference. Emotional tone fluctuates naturally. Calculated tone stays consistent because it's designed to guide a response. She spoke about missed time, about wanting to be present, about making things right. But every statement moved toward one central idea, re-establishing a place in his life, not gradually, not respectfully, but efficiently. He asked her one question, calm, direct, without tension. Why now? And for the first time since the conversation started, there was a pause. Not long, not obvious, but enough, because real answers don't need time to be constructed, only strategic ones do. And that brief hesitation revealed something she hadn't intended to show, that her return wasn't spontaneous. It was timed. She recovered quickly, reframed the moment, spoke about reflection, growth, realization, but the timing still existed. And timing, when it aligns too closely with change in circumstances, becomes part of the answer. He let her finish. Then he did something she didn't expect. He didn't challenge her explanation. He didn't argue. He simply acknowledged it, calmly. And then he added something that shifted everything. You didn't come back because of me. Silence. Immediate. Complete. That sentence didn't accuse, it clarified. And clarification, when accurate, removes the ability to redirect, because there's nothing to argue against, only something to accept or deny. And denial, in that moment, would have required consistency she didn't have. Her expression changed slightly, not dramatically, but enough to reveal that the structure she had built for this conversation had just cracked, because she wasn't expecting resistance, she was expecting openness. And instead, she was facing awareness. You came back because of what I built, he continued. Same tone, same calm delivery, no emotion, just observation, and that made it land harder, because emotion can be dismissed, observation can't. She tried to respond, to reshape the moment, to bring it back to something softer. But once intention is exposed, redirection becomes obvious, and obvious strategies don't work. For the first time since she walked in, she didn't have control of the conversation, not because he took it forcefully, but because she lost it naturally. And that's what real power looks like. Not dominance, but stability. "I'm not angry," he said, and that statement carried weight, because anger would have given her something to work with, something to respond to, something to manipulate. But absence of anger removes leverage. "I just understand." And understanding ends illusion. She looked at him differently now, not as someone she could guide, but as someone she couldn't predict. And unpredictability in control situations creates discomfort. "I don't need anything from you," he added. And that sentence changed the entire dynamic, because need is what creates vulnerability, and without vulnerability there's no entry point. The conversation didn't escalate, it didn't turn emotional, it didn't break down dramatically, because not all confrontations explode. Some resolve quietly. And this one did, not with noise but with clarity. She realized it, not all at once, but enough to understand that the outcome she expected wasn't happening, because she didn't just lose control of the conversation, she lost access, and access, once denied clearly, doesn't reopen easily. He stood up calmly, not as an escape, but as a conclusion. Because the conversation had already ended before either of them said it. He didn't rush out after standing up. He didn't create a dramatic exit or say anything that would turn the moment into something louder than it needed to be. Because when something is already clear, adding noise doesn't make it stronger, it just distracts from it. Instead, he paused for a second, just enough to acknowledge that the conversation had reached its natural end. Not forced, not interrupted, just complete. And in that quiet pause, something settled between them. Not resolution, not reconciliation, just understanding, the kind that doesn't need agreement to exist. She didn't stop him as he turned to leave, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't know how. Because for the first time since she had walked back into his life, she had nothing structured left to say. No prepared explanation, no controlled response, just a moment she hadn't planned for. And unplanned moments reveal more than prepared ones ever can. When he walked out, the world outside didn't feel different. The air wasn't heavier, the environment hadn't changed, but internally something had shifted completely. Because closure doesn't always come from getting answers. Sometimes it comes from recognizing that you no longer need them. He didn't think about her on the way home, not actively, not intentionally, because once something is understood fully, it stops demanding attention, and attention, when no longer required, naturally moves elsewhere. His father noticed the difference the moment he walked in. Not in his words, but in his presence, because presence carries information, words don't. And this presence wasn't conflicted, it wasn't uncertain, it was settled. "How did it go?" his father asked. "Simple, direct. No pressure behind it. It went exactly how it needed to," he replied. And that answer, while brief, carried something deeper than detail. It carried completion. They didn't discuss it further that night, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer needed processing. And when something no longer needs to be processed, it's no longer controlling anything. Days passed, then weeks. And life continued, not dramatically, not differently, but steadily. The structure he had built before she returned remained unchanged, because it was never dependent on her absence or her presence, and that's what made the difference. Because stability that exists independently can't be disrupted easily. She didn't reach out again, not immediately, and when she eventually did, the message was different, shorter, simpler, without direction, without expectation. Because something had changed on her side too, not completely, but enough to remove assumption. He read it, not emotionally, not reactively, just neutrally, and then he made a decision, not about her, but about boundaries, because boundaries aren't about keeping people out. They're about defining how they're allowed in. He didn't respond right away, not as a delay, but as a choice. Because response, when given without intention, creates patterns, and patterns define relationships. Eventually, he replied, not with rejection, not with openness, but with clarity. Controlled, measured, enough to acknowledge, but not enough to reopen what had been closed. And that balance mattered, because it allowed something important to exist, distance without hostility. From that point forward, everything between them existed in that space, not broken, not repaired, just defined. And sometimes definition is more important than resolution, because not every relationship returns to what it was. Some evolve into something else entirely, and that something else isn't always negative. It's just real. As for everything he had built, it continued to grow, not because of what happened, but because of how he chose to respond to it. Because experiences don't define outcomes, responses do. And his response wasn't emotional, it wasn't reactive, it was intentional. And intentional, when consistent, creates direction. The millions she had returned for were never taken, never shared, never even discussed again, because in the end, it was never about the money, it was about access. And access is something you don't regain just by showing up. You earn it, or you lose it. And she had already made that choice years ago when she walked away without looking back. The difference now was that he didn't wait for her to realize it. He understood it first, and understanding is what gave him control, not over her, but over himself. And that kind of control is the only one that actually lasts, because people can come back, situations can change, circumstances can shift, but once clarity is built, it doesn't disappear. It stays, quietly guiding every decision that comes after. And in the end, that mattered more than anything she came back for, because she returned for something valuable, but left realizing something priceless. He didn't need closure from her. He created it himself. Sometimes people don't come back because they care. They come back because they finally see your value. The real power? Choosing whether they still get access to it.